Jalen Carter was only 12. But the moment he walked into that seminar hall, every professor smirked. They didn't see brilliance, only a black boy who didn't belong. When they wrote a problem no child could solve, the room laughed at the thought of him even trying. But as the chalk scraped across the board, Jalen's hand stopped. He saw a flaw no one else did. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The lecture hall was cathedral-like, its walls lined with towering shelves of books that smelled of dust and privilege. Heavy oak tables gleamed under soft golden light, and the polished floor carried the footsteps of men and women who believed they belonged to a world of answers. Every seat seemed reserved for someone who had already proven their worth through years of academia. They wore crisp suits, carried leather satchels, and spoke in hushed tones that oozed confidence. Into this temple of intellect walked a boy 12 years old, skin rich and dark, his sneakers scuffed at the edges, his shirt slightly too big for his lean frame. Jalen Carter held his notebook like a shield, his fingers pressing into the thin cardboard cover, as if it could protect him from the stairs already burning holes into his back. He didn't belong here, not by their standards. A murmur passed through the room, like a ripple of disbelief. The professors, most of them white, looked at him, then at each other. Some smirked, others frowned, a few whispered, "Whose child is this?" The elite students in the room, older, confident, and already halfway into careers, snickered under their breath. Jalen took his seat at the very end of the long table. The chair was too large, swallowing his small frame, and when he tried to adjust, the squeak of the wood echoed, drawing more eyes to him. He kept his head down, staring at the page in front of him, where the pencil marks from his restless doodling made faint shadows. The professors continued their conversation, but it was impossible for him not to hear the undertone. "Surely this is a mistake. Is this some kind of diversity stunt? He'll be gone in minutes. These problems aren't child's play." Jalen's heart thudded louder than the clock on the wall. He wanted to disappear, yet something inside him, a mix of quiet pride and stubborn defiance, kept his spine straight. The lead professor, Dr. Whitmore, adjusted his glasses and looked across the room. His voice carried the calm authority of a man who had never been doubted. "Today, we will examine a problem that has eluded even our most brilliant graduate students. It is, in short, impossible." He smiled, as though the impossibility of it made him stronger, untouchable. Laughter rippled politely among the professors. Jalen's eyes flickered toward the chalkboard. Equations sprawled across it like a foreign language, symbols and numbers entangled in ways that seemed designed to intimidate. But intimidation wasn't new to him. He had been told he couldn't do things all his life. He had been laughed at, ignored, underestimated, and every time that sting had sharpened him, like pressure turning coal to diamond. He leaned forward slightly, scanning the details. To him it wasn't noise, it wasn't impossible. It was a puzzle, messy, yes, but not unsolvable. The students around him shuffled papers, murmuring theories to one another. One of them, a tall boy with sandy hair and an arrogant smirk, leaned back in his chair. "No kid's gonna understand this. I don't even understand this." He made sure his voice carried. Jalen didn't look up. He had learned that the quickest way to become a target was to react. Still, the words dug into him, joining the collection of insults he carried like invisible scars. Dr. Whitmore raised his hand for silence. "So then, who among us is bold enough to attempt it?" He looked around at his fellow professors, who shook their heads with amused resignation. As expected, no takers. Perhaps one of our brightest students. Silence stretched across the room. Jalen's chest tightened. He knew the answer wasn't complete in his head yet, but the shape of it, like the faint outline of a hidden drawing, was already forming. That's when it happened. Someone in the back snorted, then whispered just loud enough for all to hear, "Maybe the little boy can give it a shot. He looks like he's got nothing to lose." The room erupted in laughter, not cruel in tone, but cruel in intent, the kind of laughter that excluded, dismissed, erased. Jalen froze. His ears burned, his throat tightened. He knew if he kept his head down, the moment would pass. They would forget him, return to their world of impossible problems and ivory towers. But something heavier weighed on him, the memory of his mother's voice that morning. "Baby, you don't let them tell you who you are. You show them. Even if your hands shake, you show them." His hands were shaking. His pencil trembled as if it wanted to run from him. He looked up, meeting the wall of faces. Their laughter still rang in his ears, But behind it he saw what they expected. Silence. Compliance. Defeat. And that was the one thing he could not give them. Slowly, deliberately, Jalen lifted his hand. The laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, bolder, as if his raised hand confirmed their belief that this was a circus, a joke. Dr. Whitmore himself raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into the faintest smile of disbelief. But Jalen's hand stayed in the air, steady now, his gaze locked on the board, not on them. He wasn't asking for their permission. He was daring them to listen. And in that instant, the room changed. The professors leaned forward, some amused, some annoyed, others curious despite themselves. The students stopped their side conversations, sensing something unusual was about to unfold. The boy who should have remained invisible was demanding to be seen. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against Jalen's chest. He could feel his pulse in his temples, hear the rush of his blood in his ears. This was the moment. Either he would rise and shock them all, or collapse under the weight of their expectations. Dr. Whitmore cleared his throat, the faintest smirk still on his lips. "Young man," he said, his voice laced with skepticism, "are you suggesting that you can solve this?" Jalen swallowed hard, his hand still raised. The laughter bubbled again, sharper this time, like knives against glass. And then, without flinching, Jalen nodded. The room froze, every eye locked on him, every whisper cut off mid-breath. For the first time in his life, Jalen Carter wasn't invisible anymore. The professors laughed louder, convinced this was the punchline of the day. But Jalen's hand didn't waver. The raised hand in that hallowed hall carried far more than the courage of a single boy. It carried generations. Jalen himself might not have fully understood it yet, but his mother had lived long enough to know. Every time her son walked into a room where no one expected him to be, he carried her fight, her father's scars, her grandmother's prayers, and the silent weight of history pressing on his small shoulders. Danielle Carter had raised Jalen alone since the day he was born. Their home sat on the far side of the city, an aging two-bedroom apartment on the edge of a neighborhood that bus routes skipped and grocery stores forgot. The paint peeled on the corners of their building, and the front steps cracked in ways the landlord promised for years to fix. But inside their door, Danielle worked miracles. She filled their walls with books from thrift stores, newspapers, and borrowed encyclopedias. She knew what the world was likely to withhold from her son, so she stocked his small world with the tools he would need to push back. Danielle's job as a nurse's aide demanded long hours, cleaning bedpans and changing sheets for patients who often refused to look her in the eye. She endured comments like, "Get the real nurse, sweetheart," or "You people don't always get these things right." Each word was another reminder that her skin was a barrier she couldn't shed, no matter how hard she worked. Yet every shift, she came home exhausted but determined, because Jalen was waiting. Even as a little boy, Jalen's curiosity burned brighter than his weariness. He would sit at their kitchen table late into the night, scratching equations onto scrap paper. Danielle would watch him sometimes, his brows furrowed, lips moving as though whispering secrets to numbers. He didn't ask for toys, he asked for more notebooks, more pencils, more problems to solve. And she gave him everything she could, even when money was tight. One night, Danielle had returned from work with sore feet and aching hands. She found Jalen at the table, sketching a grid of numbers. He looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mom, did you know some numbers repeat patterns forever? Like they don't stop?" Danielle smiled tiredly, setting down her bag. "You mean like decimals?" Jalen nodded eagerly. "Yeah, but I think there's something bigger, like a rhythm hidden inside." She kissed the top of his head, pride warming her chest despite her exhaustion. "Baby, if you can see rhythms where others see noise, you'll never be lost." But outside their home, the world didn't see him that way. At school, Jalen's quick mind was more curse than gift. When he finished assignments early, teachers accused him of rushing. When he solved problems in ways that didn't match their instructions, they docked his grade. His classmates mocked him for acting like he was smarter than everyone else. In the cafeteria, he often sat alone. The teachers didn't intervene. Sometimes they even seemed relieved that he wasn't part of the main crowd. Danielle fought back quietly at first. She sent emails, requested conferences, and attended school board meetings where her voice was drowned in polite nods and dismissive smiles. One administrator once said to her, "Mrs. Carter, I think you should focus on realistic goals for Jalen. He'll do fine, just not in advanced tracks." Her jaw tightened that day, but she swallowed her anger. She had learned long ago that rage was used against women like her. Instead, she went home and told Jalen, "Don't let them put you in a box they built to keep you small." Jalen listened, but he also felt the sting. His classmates were praised for achievements that came slower than his. When they stumbled, teachers encouraged them. When he stumbled, they doubted him. Each dismissal carved another weight into his spirit, another reminder that brilliance didn't cancel out the color of his skin in their eyes. Still, Danielle pushed. She found after-school math clubs, begged for him to be included in STEM programs, and worked extra shifts to pay for tutors who barely kept pace with her son's curiosity. She believed if he had a chance to be seen by the right people, someone would recognize his potential. And then the invitation came. Or rather, it didn't. At the start of 6th grade, the school announced that a handful of students would be nominated for a prestigious university seminar where professors presented cutting-edge challenges. It was the kind of event that could change a student's path forever. Danielle was certain Jalen would be included. She checked the mailbox every day, waiting. But when the letter arrived, the envelope carried someone else's name. Danielle stood in the kitchen with the crumpled paper in her hand, her pulse pounding in her temples. She read the list 3 times, searching for her son's name, but it wasn't there. Jalen stood in the doorway, watching her face. He didn't need to ask. He knew. His shoulders slumped, but his eyes didn't well with tears. Instead, they hardened, as though he had expected this all along. "It's fine, Mom," he said softly. "They never put me on the lists anyway." It wasn't fine. Danielle knew it. She drove to the school the next morning, stormed into the office, and demanded answers. The principal shifted in his chair, his smile tight. "Mrs. Carter, the selection was based on teacher recommendations and performance data. Jalen is bright, but he's not a fit for this program." Her voice shook, not from fear but from fury restrained. "Not a fit? He's been solving problems years ahead of his grade level, since he was 8. The principal folded his hands. "He lacks discipline. He doesn't always follow the method we teach." Danielle leaned across the desk, her eyes sharp. Maybe the method is the problem. He dismissed her with bureaucratic politeness, the kind that burned more than outright cruelty. But Danielle wasn't done. She knew whispers carried power, and she knew where to find them. That afternoon, as she picked up Jalen from school, she lingered by the staff lounge. Voices drifted through the half-closed door. Teachers, unaware she was outside, spoke freely. "Brilliant. He just gets lucky sometimes. He'll never belong in advanced studies. You can't build a program around outliers. Besides, kids like him, they don't last in these environments." Danielle's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she clutched her son's backpack straps tighter. The casual cruelty of those whispers cut deeper than open insults ever could. And what made it worse was knowing they weren't just talking about her boy. They were talking about every boy who looked like him. Danielle closed her eyes, fighting back the sting of tears. What she didn't realize was that Jalen had overheard too, and the words would brand themselves into his memory forever. The whispers Danielle overheard did not stay confined to the staff lounge. They seeped into the classroom like smoke, invisible but suffocating. Jalen felt it in the way his teacher's eyes lingered on him too long, searching for mistakes, waiting for cracks. He felt it in the way his classmates glanced sideways whenever he raised his hand, their expressions balancing between annoyance and suspicion. It was the math test that broke the illusion. The class sat in silence, pencils scratching across paper. The clock ticked steadily overhead. Most students hunched over their desks, erasers smudging holes in the corners of their worksheets. Jalen finished his exam before the halfway mark. He set his pencil down, folded his hands, and stared straight ahead. The teacher, Mrs. Crowley, noticed. Her lips tightened. "Jalen," she said sharply, "if you're done, double-check your work. Don't rush." "I did," he replied quietly. Her brows furrowed. She walked down the aisle, heels clicking against the tile, and stopped at his desk. Without asking, she picked up his paper and flipped through it. Her frown deepened with every answer that aligned perfectly. Every equation balanced, every step explained. She set the paper back down, but leaned closer, her voice low enough for the rest of the class to strain to hear. "You're not fooling me. Nobody finishes this exam that quickly, unless they already had the answers." Jalen's throat tightened. Heat rose to his cheeks. "I did." "Quiet," she snapped. A ripple passed through the room. His classmates exchanged knowing looks. Some smirked. Others whispered. The seed was planted. Jalen Carter cheated. When the graded tests came back, his paper bore no red marks. Every answer was correct. Yet at the top corner, instead of an a single word in her sharp, slanted handwriting stood out. Luck. He stared at it until the letters blurred. That evening, Danielle noticed the silence at dinner. Jalen pushed peas around his plate without eating. Finally, he slid the paper across the table. She read it, her jaw tightening with every second. They wrote this? She asked. He nodded. Her eyes softened, though anger burned beneath. Baby, that's not luck. That's work. That's your mind. But everyone thinks. He swallowed hard. If even the teacher doesn't believe me, then what's the point? Danielle reached across the table, taking his small hand in hers. The point is, you don't let them define you. They'll try. They'll keep trying. But you're not here to make them comfortable, Jalen. You're here to shine, whether they like it or not. Her words steadied him, but the damage lingered. In class, when he solved problems quickly, the other kids rolled their eyes. Show off, one muttered. Another whispered, bet he's cheating again. Laughter followed him down the hallways. Not loud enough for teachers to intervene, but sharp enough to cut. The real test came when the school announced the new gifted program. Only a handful of students would be admitted, based on demonstrated ability. For weeks, Jalen's hopes surged. He knew he could handle it. His work proved it. Danielle filled out every form, attended every meeting, and made sure his name was on the list for review. The day of the announcement, the class buzzed with excitement. Names were read aloud, one by one. Each child whooped, grinned, and received congratulations from their friends. Jalen sat straight in his chair, waiting. The list ended. His name never came. For a moment, silence roared in his ears. He looked around the room, but no one seemed surprised. The teacher's lips curved into a polite smile as if the outcome had been inevitable. Better luck next time, Mrs. Crowley said softly. But the faint smirk on her face betrayed the cruelty underneath. That night, Danielle stormed into the principal's office. Her voice shook with restrained fury. Explain to me how my son, who's been solving material 2 grades ahead, was passed over. The principal leaned back in his chair, choosing his words with practiced calm. Mrs. Carter, we evaluate more than raw intelligence. We consider discipline, consistency, behavior. Discipline? Danielle cut in. You mean he doesn't color inside your lines? He finds his own path. The principal sighed. Gifted programs aren't just about intelligence. They're about fit. Danielle's hands trembled against the edge of the desk. So you're telling me that brilliance isn't enough if it comes in black skin? His expression hardened. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. She left the office shaking, but when she saw Jalen waiting in the hallway, head bowed, she forced her anger down. She knelt beside him, brushing his cheek with her hand. This isn't about you, baby. It's about them. Don't you dare think for a second you're not enough. But Jalen heard only the echo of the announcement. His name missing. His place denied. Weeks passed, but the wound stayed open. He worked harder, pushing himself late into the night, scribbling numbers and theories into notebooks, until his pencil dulled. Danielle would peek in and whisper, "Get some sleep," but he always shook his head. Just one more problem. Then, one morning, the air in the school buzzed with unusual energy. A stack of envelopes had arrived. Cream-colored, heavy, official. They bore the seal of a prestigious university. The teacher passed them out, one by one, to a select group of students. Each envelope carried an invitation to a seminar where elite professors would challenge young minds. Jalen watched each name called. He kept his hands folded on his desk, waiting, heart pounding. Surely this was his chance. Surely they couldn't deny him twice. The last envelope was handed out. His desk remained empty. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at the clean surface in front of him, as though his name might still appear if he wished hard enough. A boy across the aisle tore open his letter with a grin. I got in, he shouted. The class erupted in cheers. Jalen's chest tightened. Around him, the room filled with joy. But in his corner, silence pressed heavier than ever. That night, when Danielle checked the mail, she found nothing with her son's name. Her hands shook as she shuffled through the stack again and again, praying she'd missed it. But the truth was plain. Jalen Carter had not been chosen. Danielle gripped the empty envelopes, until they crumpled in her hands. What she didn't know was that Jalen had already heard whispers in the hallway, that his exclusion wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. The crumpled envelopes, lay on the kitchen counter like a verdict. Danielle smoothed one out with her palm, as if pressing the creases would change the truth printed inside. Across the table, Jalen sat motionless, his notebook closed for the first time in weeks. His silence carried more weight than words could. "Baby," Danielle said softly. "We'll find another way." But Jalen didn't respond. He just stared at the wall, jaw clenched, his eyes glassy but refusing to break. Danielle recognized the look. It was the quiet, heavy silence of someone who had already learned too young what it meant to be dismissed. That night, while Jalen lay in bed, pretending to sleep, Danielle sat at the kitchen table with the dim lamp, casting long shadows. She held her pen so tightly, her knuckles, letter after letter spilled across the page, to the principal, to the district office, to the seminar organizers themselves. She wrote with the urgency of a mother who had nothing left to lose. By morning her decision was made. She marched into the school with her head high, every step echoing her resolve. Parents waiting in the office turned their heads as Danielle's voice carried through the hallway. "You tell me right now why my son wasn't considered," she demanded. The secretary stammered, eyes darting toward the principal's closed door. Within minutes, Danielle was ushered inside. The principal leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his calm demeanor rehearsed. "Mrs. Carter, as I've said before, the selection process is competitive. Only a few can attend." Danielle planted both hands on his desk, leaning forward. "Don't give me lines. Give me the truth." His mask slipped for just a second. "Your son doesn't fit the profile, Mrs. Carter." The words hung in the air like a slap. Danielle's voice trembled, not with fear but fury. "Profile? You mean he doesn't fit your idea of what brilliance looks like?" The principal's eyes flickered away. He reached for a folder, stalling. "The matter's closed. I'm sorry." But Danielle wasn't. She stormed out, refusing to be silenced. By the time she got home, she had already emailed the seminar board herself, attaching copies of Jalen's test scores, his notebooks filled with advanced work, and a plea that was more than words. It was a mother's fight carved onto paper. 2 weeks later, the impossible happened. An envelope arrived. This time Jalen's name was printed clean and clear on the front. Danielle tore it open with shaking hands. The letter was short, formal, almost cold, but its meaning was everything. "Your son has been granted a seat at the university seminar." Jalen read the words twice, disbelief flickering across his face. Then, slowly, something lit behind his eyes. Not joy, not quite, but a cautious spark. But word traveled fast. By Monday, whispers filled the classroom. He didn't earn it. His mom begged for him. They only gave him a spot so they wouldn't look racist. He'll embarrass himself in front of real geniuses. Jalen heard it all. Each whisper stuck to him like burrs, dragging behind him everywhere he walked. When he sat at his desk, kids shifted away. At lunch, trays clattered as classmates found other tables. Even the teachers' glances carried a subtle judgment, as if silently agreeing with the rumors. One afternoon, as Jalen gathered his books, a boy with sandy hair smirked at him. "Hope you enjoy your little field trip, Carter. Don't worry, no one expects you to actually solve anything." The laughter that followed sliced deeper than the words themselves. Jalen clenched his fists but said nothing. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "Don't let them drag you into the mud. Show them instead." Danielle, meanwhile, prepared her son the only way she knew how. She didn't buy new clothes or notebooks. Money was too tight. Instead, she sat with him at their kitchen table every night, reviewing problems, pushing him, encouraging him. "They'll try to make you small," she told him, her voice steady. "But when the moment comes, you remember who you are." The morning of the seminar arrived gray and heavy with rain. Danielle smoothed Jalen's collar before he left, her hands lingering just a moment longer than usual. "You walk in there like you belong, baby," she whispered. "Because you do." The university loomed like a fortress of stone and glass. Students and parents streamed inside, umbrellas dripping. Jalen kept close to Danielle as they entered the grand hall. Marble floors gleamed beneath the soft glow of chandeliers. Rows of professors lined the front, their suits pressed, their eyes sharp. Jalen felt the weight of every glance. Some professors ignored him completely. Others let their eyes linger just long enough to register surprise. Then skepticism. His sneakers squeaked against the floor, out of place among polished shoes. His chair seemed to shrink beneath him, as though reminding him he was the smallest presence in the room. The whispers started immediately. "Is that a middle schooler? They let him in?" That's absurd. This is going to be embarrassing. Jalen's stomach twisted. He wanted to disappear, but he forced himself to sit straighter. He remembered his mother's words. You show them, even if your hands shake. Danielle found a seat at the back, her eyes never leaving her son. She sat tall, though inside her heart raced. She knew this was no ordinary seminar, it was an arena. At the front, the lead professor, Dr. Whitmore, stepped forward. His voice carried with practiced authority. Welcome, scholars. Today you will confront a problem that has humbled even our brightest graduate students. A problem so complex, so layered, that many have called it unsolvable. The room stirred with excitement. Pencils clicked, notebooks opened. Jalen's pulse quickened. Dr. Whitmore smiled faintly, adjusting his glasses. Consider this your battlefield. If you can even approach the solution, you will have done more than most. He turned to the chalkboard and began to write. Symbols sprawled across the slate, equations snaking in every direction. The chalk screeched, filling the air with fragments of numbers and variables, until the board seemed more like a wall than a window. Students leaned forward, scribbling furiously. Professors exchanged knowing glances, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of intellectual war. Jalen stared at the board, the sound of chalk echoing in his chest like a drumbeat. His heart pounded, his palms damp. Yet amid the chaos of symbols, he saw something different, not walls, but cracks, tiny gaps that others missed, threads waiting to be pulled. He blinked, his mind racing faster than his fear. As the last symbol hit the board, Dr. Whitmore turned to the hall with a confident smile. This, he declared, is the problem no child could ever solve. And all at once, every eye shifted toward Jalen. The chalk squeal faded into silence, leaving the board crammed with lines of symbols, fractions, and looping equations. Dr. Whitmore set the chalk down, as if he had just carved a monument, his hand dusted white, his expression proud. The students leaned forward, pens racing across their notebooks. The professors exchanged subtle nods of acknowledgement, their eyes glinting with the satisfaction of watching complexity overwhelm the room. And there, at the far end of the long polished table, sat Jalen Carter. His chair felt enormous, swallowing his thin frame. His feet dangled a few inches above the ground, the sneakers too worn for the marble floor beneath them. His notebook sat closed, untouched. He hadn't yet written a word, because the problem on the board demanded more than automatic scribbles. It demanded vision. Around him, the air buzzed with practiced confidence. Students, mostly older teens from prestigious schools, spoke in low but assured tones. If you separate the variables here, no. The sequence collapses if you assume linearity. Obviously, you need to apply matrix reduction first. Their words overlapped, a chorus of certainty. No one looked at Jalen. No one acknowledged the small boy at the end of the table. It was as though the seat he occupied was meant to stay empty, and his presence was an error the room was too polite or too arrogant to correct. Jalen's pulse raced. He knew he didn't belong here in their eyes. His skin, his age, his very presence, each detail screamed out of place. The professors glanced past him as though scanning the air. Even when one brushed by his chair, their eyes avoided his face, skimming the surface of his existence, without landing. He was invisible, but invisibility carried its own burden, the weight of knowing they'd only notice if he failed. He gripped his pencil, the wood pressing hard against his palm. From the back of the hall, Danielle watched. She sat still, her hands folded in her lap, though her knuckles whitened against each other. Every laugh, every dismissive glance that skimmed past her son, stabbed at her chest. She wanted to stand, to shout, to demand they see him. But she knew this battle wasn't hers to fight. Not directly. It was his. Dr. Whitmore's voice sliced through the murmurs. This problem has humbled graduate students and faculty alike. If any of you can approach even a partial solution, you will have done something remarkable. His eyes flicked across the room but skipped over Jalen entirely, as though even his gaze refused to acknowledge a child's presence. The students bent their heads to the work, pens scratching. Some muttered under their breath, flipping through the thick packets of formulas provided. The sound was steady, purposeful, assured. Jalen opened his notebook at last. His pencil hovered, then pressed down gently. But instead of writing the problem as it appeared, he drew a small box in the corner of the page. Inside it he wrote the first symbol that caught his eye, then another, and another. He wasn't copying the problem. He was unraveling it. Because while the others stared at the wall of equations as though it were a fortress, Jalen saw cracks in the stone. His eyes lingered on a misplaced coefficient, a symmetry that broke halfway through the board, tiny flaws hid in the noise, flaws that no one else seemed to notice. He leaned closer, heartbeat quickening. It was subtle, buried in the mass of chalk lines. But to him, it gleamed like a thread waiting to be pulled. Around him, students grumbled. One slammed his pencil down. "This is pointless," the boy muttered. "It's not solvable." Another girl whispered. "They call this a challenge? It's just cruel." The professors exchanged smug glances. Their silence was almost mocking, as though the failure of the students only reinforced their authority. Jalen's pencil tapped against his page. He didn't want to be noticed. Not yet. He wanted time to think, to let the pieces fall together in his mind. But his silence was dangerous, too. He knew how easily silence could be mistaken for ignorance, for incapability. He glanced at Danielle. From across the room, her eyes found his. She didn't speak, didn't move, but he heard her voice in his head. "Anyway, you show them, baby. Even if your hands shake." Jalen's hands did shake, but his eyes were steady. The boy beside him, the one with sandy hair, glanced at Jalen's notebook and smirked. "What's the matter, Carter? Board too big for you? That you can't even read half the symbols?" A few students chuckled. Jalen closed his notebook, hiding the small corner of notes he had made. His chest burned, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that defending himself with words only fed the fire. The only way forward was proof. Dr. Whitmore, overhearing the laughter, smiled faintly. "It's all right, Mr. Carter. No one expects you to solve this. Observe, take notes, learn from your peers." The professors chuckled softly. The dismissal was casual, but it struck like a blade. Jalen lowered his head for a moment. His stomach knotted, his throat tightened. Every instinct told him to stay quiet, to survive the hour and leave unseen. But the flaw on the board tugged at him, demanding attention. It whispered louder than the laughter, stronger than the sting. He reopened his notebook. This time, he let his pencil move freely, sketching lines and numbers, pulling threads. One by one, the cracks began to connect, and then, suddenly, his breath caught. It wasn't just a flaw, it was a doorway. The equation wasn't unsolvable. It had been set up wrong from the start. A tiny error in the early sequence had poisoned everything after it. The professors hadn't noticed. The graduate students hadn't noticed. But Jalen had. His pulse thundered in his ears. He stared at the board, then at the professors. Should he say it? Should he risk laughter, dismissal, humiliation? Because if he was wrong, they would bury him under it. But if he was right. The room buzzed with frustration, as students scribbled, crossed out, and started over. Some whispered frantically, their confidence unraveling. Professors whispered among themselves, amused at the chaos. Jalen's hand trembled above his notebook. He could hear the sandy-haired boy whisper again. "He doesn't even get it." Jalen lifted his chin. For the first time, his gaze didn't waver. He saw what none of them did. He knew what they didn't. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand. The room stilled. Every head turned, expressions ranging from confusion to mockery. Whispers rippled like wind through grass. A 12-year-old boy, the one dismissed, the one ignored, the one told to simply observe, was signaling he had something to say. Dr. Whitmore arched an eyebrow, the corners of his mouth twitching upward in amusement. "Yes, Mr. Carter?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. Jalen's voice caught in his throat, but he pushed it out anyway. "I think there's a mistake." The words hung in the air, heavy and electric. For a moment, silence blanketed the room. Then laughter erupted, sharp and dismissive, bouncing off the marble walls. Professors chuckled into their hands. Students shook their heads. The sandy-haired boy clapped slowly, mocking. "Of course. The kid thinks he's smarter than all of us." Jalen didn't flinch. He kept his hand raised, his eyes locked on the board. His voice, though soft, carried an edge of certainty. "There's something wrong in the setup." The laughter grew, but beneath it, one professor stopped smiling, his eyes narrowing at the board, as though realizing Jalen might be right. For a heartbeat, the hall hung in silence after Jalen's words. Then the first chuckle escaped, a low, dismissive sound that cracked the stillness. Others followed, rising into a chorus of laughter that ricocheted off the marble walls. It wasn't the laughter of humor. It was sharper, pointed, a blade disguised as sound. Students slapped their desks, professors leaned back with indulgent smiles. Even those who didn't laugh outright smirked, their silence complicit. Jalen sat frozen, heat flooding his face. His small hand still hovered in the air, but now it felt unbearably heavy, as though the weight of the entire room pressed it down. Dr. Whitmore's voice cut through the noise, dripping with condescension. "Mr. Carter, you're suggesting there's a flaw in the setup. Do you realize how many brilliant minds have reviewed this equation? People who've studied longer than you've been alive." Jalen swallowed hard. His voice came out soft but steady. I noticed something that doesn't match." The room roared again, louder this time. One professor leaned toward another and muttered just loud enough to carry. "He probably can't even spell half these terms." The words landed like stones. Students burst out laughing, slapping their desks in approval. It wasn't just mockery, it was dismissal wrapped in academic superiority. From the back of the hall, Danielle's nails dug into her palms until crescents marked her skin. Her chest tightened, her instinct screaming to stand up, to shield her boy from the cruelty disguised as intellect. But she stayed rooted, her breath sharp, knowing this battlefield was one he had to navigate alone. Jalen's ears rang with the sound of their derision. He could almost feel the laughter wrapping around him like chains, pulling tighter with every second. He could retreat, let the moment pass, sink back into invisibility. It would be easier, safer. But something inside him refused. He thought of the words scribbled across his last test. Luck. He thought of the empty desk when the seminar letters were handed out. He thought of the whispers his mother overheard, of teachers saying he would never belong. And then he thought of Danielle's voice. "Show them, baby. Even if your hands shake." His hands did shake, but he raised his chin, forcing his voice louder this time. "The mistake is at the start. If you check the sequence here." He pointed toward the far left section of the board, where the initial equation bled into a long chain of derivations. The room fell quieter, though not out of respect, more like the silence before a punchline. Dr. Whitmore crossed his arms. "And what makes you so certain, Mr. Carter?" Jalen hesitated, feeling the weight of 100 eyes. "Because if you carry the coefficient through without balancing here." He tapped his pencil against his notebook. "The rest collapses. It's not impossible. It's just wrong." A ripple moved through the students. Some frowned at the board, tracing the lines with their eyes. Others scoffed, shaking their heads. The sandy-haired boy sitting near Jalen snorted. "Listen to him. Acting like he's smarter than professors. What's next, Carter? You gonna teach us all?" Laughter flared again, sharp and eager. Dr. Whitmore let the noise rise, then raised his hand for silence. His smile was thin, tight. "Mr. Carter, I appreciate your enthusiasm. But mathematics at this level requires rigor, not guesses. Perhaps in a few years you'll understand." The professors chuckled. A few nodded approvingly at Whitmore's dismissal. Jalen felt his stomach twist, but he didn't lower his eyes. He pressed his pencil harder into the page, his handwriting turning jagged. "It's not a guess," he whispered. The professor closest to him leaned forward, smirking. "What was that?" Jalen's voice steadied. "It's not a guess." The room bristled. Some students looked amused, others annoyed. The audacity of a 12-year-old refusing to shrink was a violation of the unwritten rules. Dr. Whitmore's smile faltered just slightly. "Then by all means, Mr. Carter, show us." Jalen's chest tightened. His heart thundered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed that stepping forward would only make him a bigger target. But the thread he had pulled at in his notebook still gleamed in his mind. Insist. Danielle's breath caught in the back of the hall. She could see her son teetering on the edge, standing between collapse and defiance. Her lips moved soundlessly. "You can do this." Jalen closed his notebook slowly. His palms were damp, but his voice, when it came, was firmer than before. "If you want me to show you, I will." The laughter started again, but this time it was tinged with disbelief. Students leaned back in their chairs, waiting for the spectacle. Professors exchanged glances, some amused, some irritated, a few curious despite themselves. The sandy-haired boy whispered loudly, "This is gonna be good. Watch him crash." Jalen stood, his small frame dwarfed by the towering board and the sea of older students around him. For the first time, every eye in the room was locked on him, not with respect, but with hunger, eager to see him fail. He took a single step forward, then stopped, his pulse hammering in his ears. He knew each second made him a bigger target. Every breath invited more ridicule. But he also knew something else. If he sat back down, invisible again, nothing would ever change. And so, despite the storm gathering around him, Jalen squared his shoulders. He decided not to back down. The boy who was never supposed to speak was about to challenge the giants, knowing the moment he opened his mouth again, the knives of their laughter would be sharper than ever. From her seat at the back of the seminar hall, Danielle Carter sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap, nails pressing crescents into her palms. To the professors and students up front, she was invisible, just another parent observing quietly, blending into the background. But inside she was a storm contained within skin. Every laugh that rolled through the room felt like a lash across her back. Every dismissive glance aimed at her son was a wound she had known before. Too many times in too many rooms. And as she watched Jalen's small shoulders square against the ridicule of giants, her own memories surged like an old wound reopening. She remembered the hospital corridors. Years ago, Danielle had been 21, fresh in her scrubs, eager to prove herself as a nurse's aide. She had worked twice as hard as her colleagues, memorized procedures, anticipated needs, and stayed late without complaint. Yet her efforts rarely mattered. Doctors would glance past her when giving instructions, speaking instead to younger, less experienced white aides. Patients often mistook her for housekeeping staff, their tones changing when she corrected them. Once, when she tried to explain a vital observation about a patient's breathing, a doctor had cut her off. "Stick to your lane," he said sharply, not even bothering to meet her eyes. 2 hours later, that patient crashed. The very thing Danielle had noticed nearly killed him. The doctor had ordered an emergency intervention, never acknowledging her earlier words. Instead, he praised a white nurse for catching the signs just in time. Danielle had stood there, heart pounding, knowing the truth but swallowing it down, because speaking up would have cost her everything. She remembered the rage simmering beneath her ribs, the shame of being dismissed, not because she was wrong, but because she was. Now watching her son, she saw the same dismissal replaying. The same smirks, the same superiority, wrapped in polite cruelty. Only this time, it wasn't her being silenced. It was Jalen, and she couldn't bear it. She leaned forward in her chair, eyes narrowing, her chest rising and falling sharply. She wanted to stand up and scream at them all. Tell them her son had more brilliance in one trembling hand than they had in their entire seminar. But she stopped herself. Because she knew the trap. If she shouted now, if she became the angry black mother, they would dismiss Jalen even more. They would claim he was only defiant because she put fire in his chest, that he wasn't capable of thinking on his own. So Danielle sat still, gripping the edges of her seat. But silence was not surrender. She was calculating, watching, waiting. At the front, Jalen's small frame looked impossibly fragile against the towering board. He clutched his notebook like a lifeline. His lips moved faintly as though whispering steps to himself, but Danielle could read his body, the shaking hands, the stiff back, the eyes flicking between confidence and fear. He reminded her of herself years ago, standing in that hospital hallway, begging someone to hear her before it was too late. And she realized with piercing clarity, if he failed now, they would bury him beneath this moment for the rest of his life. Her pulse thundered. She couldn't just watch. Danielle stood slowly, careful not to draw attention. The professors at the front were too engrossed in their own spectacle to notice a single mother shifting in the back row. She slipped quietly along the wall, her steps soft against the carpeted aisle, until she reached the narrow side entrance. Through the cracked doorway, she found another vantage point, closer to the board, but hidden from direct view. She leaned against the cool wall, breath shallow, her eyes locked on her son. And then, as if drawn by some unspoken pull, Jalen's eyes lifted. Across the crowded hall, past rows of sneering students and indifferent professors, his gaze found hers. For a brief second, the chaos fell away. He saw her not just his mother, but the weight of her battles, the shield she had carried for him since the day he was born. And she saw him, not just her boy, but the echo of her defiance, the living proof that they couldn't erase her struggle, her voice, her fight. Danielle's lips moved silently. "You can't." Jalen's throat tightened. His chest rose, steadier now. The trembling in his hand didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled him. He felt the invisible thread between them, stretching across the room, binding him with strength that was older than both of them. Still, the ridicule pressed in. A professor near the board smirked, tapping his pen. Well, Mr. Carter, do enlighten us. We're all eager to hear the revelation of a 12-year-old. His tone dripped with sarcasm, and laughter rippled again. Jalen's jaw set. His eyes flicked briefly to his mother, then back to the board. He inhaled sharply, filling his lungs with courage. The sandy-haired student leaned forward with a grin. Go on, Carter. Show us how wrong you can be. Danielle's hands balled into fists. She had seen this before. The mocking before the fall. The way the powerful built their walls higher by laughing at those who dared to climb. But this time, she knew something they didn't. Her son wasn't going to back down, and if he stumbled, she would be ready. Ready to rise, to speak, to tear through their laughter with the truth of what it cost to raise brilliance in a world that refused to see it. Because Danielle Carter had spent her life biting her tongue, enduring the smirks, the dismissals, the stolen credit. But motherhood had sharpened her into something stronger. She would not be silent forever. She straightened her spine, her breath steadying. Her eyes never left Jalen's face. And in that locked gaze, mother and son made a silent vow. This was not just his fight, and it was not just her memory. This was generational. This was survival. Danielle's lips pressed together, her eyes blazing, as Jalen lifted his pencil toward the board. He was about to risk everything with one answer, and she knew the room would never be the same again. The hall was heavy with silence, though not the kind that honored discovery. It was the silence of a stage before the mockery begins, a crowd waiting to watch a stumble. Jalen stood small beneath the towering chalkboard, its symbols sprawling like an endless labyrinth. The chalk dust still lingered in the air, faintly glowing in the shafts of light, pouring through the tall windows. To the professors it was a wall of brilliance. To the students a puzzle designed to crush. To Jalen, it was something else entirely. At the front, Dr. Whitmore adjusted his glasses and turned, his eyes narrowing on the boy. His tone sharpened, slicing through the air. Mr. Carter. Perhaps you didn't hear me the first time. This is the problem that has humbled even doctoral candidates. Are you sure you want to humiliate yourself? The laughter that followed was quieter than before but sharper, laced with anticipation. It wasn't about the problem anymore. It was about the spectacle of watching a child crash. Jalen's throat felt dry, his palms damp. He thought of every time a teacher had marked his work with the word luck, of every whisper that said he didn't belong, of every door closed in his face. He thought of the letter he never received, the memory of each wound pressed against him like hands pushing him down. But then, across the room, his eyes found Danielle. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her gaze burned steady, unflinching. He heard her voice in his memory, as if she was standing beside him. You show them, baby, even if your hands shake. His hands did shake, but his chin lifted. Yes, he said quietly. His voice wavered but carried. I'm sure. A ripple spread through the hall. Some students leaned back in their chairs, smirking. Others leaned forward, hungry to witness the failure. A professor muttered under his breath. Arrogance in miniature. Dr. Whitmore tilted his head, his smile cold. Very well, Mr. Carter. Repeat the problem for us all then. Let us see if you even understand what you're looking at. He gestured at the board. The equations loomed, a forest of symbols and operations, twisting into complexity. Jalen's eyes traced the board, and slowly, he began to speak. The problem is about a divergent series, he said softly. It's supposed to balance across the sequence of variables. He stopped, the weight of every gaze pressing against him. His pulse hammered. From the back, a student whispered, He's bluffing. Another muttered, Just wait. He's going to choke. Jalen closed his eyes for half a second, blocking them out. When he opened them again, he locked onto the one place no one else had bothered to look. The sequence starts wrong, he said, louder this time. His finger pointed to the first line, where a coefficient had been mishandled, its balance thrown off. Here, you multiplied across without distributing the constant. Everything after that is built on the wrong assumption. The room stirred. Students frowned, glancing at the board. One flipped pages in his notebook, tracing the sequence. But then a professor chuckled, shaking his head. That's your grand insight? Child's arithmetic? You think no one noticed that? Another added, He's parroting something he overheard. Nothing original here. The sandy-haired boy near Jalen smirked, his voice loud enough to cut. Told you. Just a fluke. He doesn't get it. Laughter flickered again, rising like sparks. Danielle's stomach twisted. She gripped the edge of the doorway until her knuckles whitened, fighting back the urge to intervene. She could see the tremor in her son's shoulders, the weight pressing harder with every word thrown at him. But Jalen didn't lower his eyes. He pressed on. "It changes everything," he said firmly. "If the beginning is wrong, the whole chain breaks. That's why everyone thinks it's impossible. You're chasing the wrong pattern." His voice echoed in the heavy air. For the first time, the laughter paused, not from respect, but from the shock of a child refusing to retreat. Professors exchanged skeptical glances. A few students whispered furiously, flipping through their work, checking, rechecking. Dr. Whitmore's smile stiffened. "And what do you propose, Mr. Carter? That a child has spotted an oversight missed by scholars who've spent decades on this?"
"Yes," Jalen whispered. Then louder, "Yes."
The word rang fragile but unshaken. The hall erupted again. Half laughter, half outrage. Some professors muttered angrily. Others dismissed him outright. A voice called out, "Insolence." Another scoffed. "He's been fed this by someone. No way he saw it himself." But amid the storm, one professor, an older man with gray streaking his beard, leaned forward, squinting at the board. His expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. The laughter didn't reach his lips. Danielle caught it. Her breath hitched. She knew what that look meant. Doubt. Doubt in the laughter. Doubt in the certainty of the giants. Jalen clutched his pencil tighter, feeling the storm rage around him. He wanted to run, to vanish back into invisibility. But the flaw on the board wouldn't let him. It gleamed in his mind, like a thread demanding to be pulled. And he realized something else. Something sharp. Something dangerous. If he didn't speak now, someone else would eventually claim it. His silence would give them the chance to steal his sight, just as others had stolen his mother's voice in the hospital hallways. He took a deep breath, the sound trembling but deep, steadying. His next words would either shatter him or shift the room. Jalen lifted his chin, eyes burning with a defiance larger than his frame. "I'll explain," he said. And as the hall grew still, the boy everyone expected to humiliate himself opened his mouth to reveal what only he could see. For a moment, Jalen stood still, the silence pressing against his chest like a weight. Every instinct told him to sit down, to let the storm of mockery pass, to disappear back into the safety of invisibility. But his eyes stayed locked on the flaw, the thread at the start of the equation. It glowed in his mind like a lantern in a dark cave, showing him the path others had missed. He took a shaky breath. His voice trembled at first, but as the words left him, they began to form their own rhythm, quiet, deliberate, undeniable. "You started here," Jalen said, pointing to the far left equation. His finger traced the chalk lines, small hand dwarfed by the board. "But you carried the constant wrong. That means everything after it is tilted. You're not building a straight bridge, you're building a crooked one. That's why it never lines up." A murmur rippled through the room. Students paused their scribbling. A few glanced at the board with narrowed eyes, suddenly unsure. Jalen continued, his voice gaining steadiness. "If you correct it at the start, the pattern doesn't collapse. It shifts. It starts repeating differently, like a rhythm you almost hear but can't because the first beat was off." He flipped open his notebook, his pencil racing now, drawing lines, numbers, loops of symbols that danced across the page. His eyes moved with certainty, his hand quick but precise. "See, once you change this, the sequence balances. It's not impossible, it's just been written wrong." The room grew heavier, the scratching of pens slowed, then stopped entirely. Students who had been confident minutes before now stared at their pages, then back at the board, as if the ground had shifted beneath them. A professor in the front row frowned, leaning forward, adjusting his glasses. Another whispered to his colleague, "Check the sequence, he might be," but cut himself off, unwilling to finish the thought. Jalen's voice didn't falter. "It's like music. If you play one note wrong in the first bar, the whole song sounds off. But if you fix the first note, the rest falls into place. The problem isn't that it can't be solved, it's that you started wrong." The silence was no longer expectant ridicule. It was something else: confusion, doubt, a creeping recognition. Even Danielle, from the side of the hall, felt her breath hitch. She had always known her son was sharp, but watching him like this, commanding the space that tried to erase him, sent chills through her. Then, The unexpected happened. A student at the center table, an older boy with thick glasses, began flipping through his notes furiously. His pencil scratched against the page, tracing Jalen's steps. His face paled as his work lined up exactly as the boy had said. He looked up, wide-eyed. "He's right," the student whispered, almost to himself. The whisper spread like a spark through dry grass. Others began to check, muttering under their breath, flipping pages, recalculating. Slowly, faces shifted from smug certainty to uneasy realization. Jalen pressed forward, his voice clear now. "The mistake isn't at the end, it's at the beginning. Everyone's been running in circles because no one looked back at the first step." The hall was still heavy with the sound of doubt cracking through arrogance. And then, just as the shift was becoming undeniable, Dr. Whitmore slammed his palm against the desk at the front. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. "Enough," he barked. His voice was tight. His face flushed. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket as though reclaiming control. His eyes narrowed on Jalen. Cold and sharp. "That's impossible," he said firmly. "Do you expect us to believe that a 12-year-old boy saw what trained scholars missed? Where did you steal that answer from?" The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence before. Gasps rippled through the room. Some students exchanged shocked glances. Others smirked as though the accusation confirmed what they had suspected all along. A murmur swelled. Cheating. Luck, stolen ideas. Jalen froze. His chest tightened as if the air itself had turned solid. The accusation wasn't just about the problem. It was about him. About what the room already believed he was. Undeserving. Fraudulent. Out of place. Danielle's breath caught, fury igniting in her chest. She wanted to scream, to tear down the walls with the truth. Her son had spent nights bent over notebooks, pouring his mind onto pages no one else would read. But she stayed silent, trembling with restraint, because she knew how easily her voice would be twisted against him. Jalen's pulse roared in his ears. He remembered every test marked with luck, every time he had been excluded, every whisper that said he didn't belong. And now, standing before the giants, the accusation landed like a final blow. "You couldn't have done this. Not you." He clenched his pencil tighter, the wood digging into his palm. For a second, his vision blurred with the sting of tears he refused to let fall. Dr. Whitmore's voice cut again, sharp as a blade. "Tell us the truth, Mr. Carter. Who fed you this solution?" The room leaned in, waiting to watch him crumble. Jalen's lips parted, not to retreat, but to deliver an answer that would either clear him or destroy him. Jalen's throat felt tight, his chest heaving, as though the air itself resisted him. Dr. Whitmore's words echoed in the hall. "Who fed you this solution?" The accusation hung heavy, louder than the laughter, sharper than the silence. Every pair of eyes bore down on him, professors stiff with disbelief, students smirking with vindication, some leaning forward as though hungry for the collapse they expected. He was standing in the spotlight of their doubt, a boy accused of daring to see what they refused to believe. But then his mother's face came into view, steady at the back of the room. Danielle's eyes didn't waver. She didn't mouth words this time. She didn't need to. Her gaze alone carried the message. "Stand. Don't bend." Jalen drew a shaky breath. His voice trembled, but it came. "Nobody fed it to me," he said. "It was mine. I saw it." The room shifted. Murmurs rose, skeptical and sharp. A professor with silver hair leaned toward his colleague, whispering, "He's rehearsed this, memorized it. There's no way." Another shook her head. "It doesn't add up. He's a child." But Jalen didn't falter. He clutched his notebook tighter and pressed forward, his words gaining strength. "I worked it out. Alone. At home. I've been writing patterns like this since I was little. You all missed it because you didn't check the first step. I just looked differently." A ripple ran through the room. Students stared, some with doubt, others with unease. Their pencils hovered but didn't move. Dr. Whitmore's lips curled, half sneer, half disbelief. "You're asking us to accept that brilliance simply sprouted from nowhere? That a 12-year-old boy stumbled into insight where entire faculties have failed?" Jalen's chin lifted. "You don't have to accept it," he said, his voice small but firm. "It's still true." The words landed like stones in the quiet. For the first time, some of the professors flinched, not outwardly, but in the small shift of posture, the narrowing of eyes. Doubt flickered, fragile but present. Danielle's heart swelled, pride burning through her chest. Her boy had said the thing she had spent her whole life biting back. Truth doesn't need permission. But the room wasn't ready to surrender. The sandy-haired student, the one who had mocked Jalen from the moment he sat down, leaned back in his chair with a smirk that stretched wide. His eyes glinted with opportunity. He stood suddenly, his voice ringing clear and loud enough for all to hear. He's lying. The hall turned toward him, the tension snapping like a wire pulled too tight. The boy gestured toward Jalen, his words rolling with smug conviction. You really think he came up with that on his own? No. He read it somewhere, maybe online, maybe in some book. He's just repeating what he memorized. He's trying to make us believe he's special. Gasps rippled through the rows of students. Some nodded. Others murmured agreement. The accusation felt plausible because it fit the story they already believed. A black boy couldn't possibly hold knowledge that outpaced them. Jalen's stomach twisted, his heart pounding against his ribs. His lips parted, but no words came at first. The laughter returned, smaller now, but sharper, fueled by the student's boldness. Danielle gripped the edge of the wall, her teeth clenched. She could see what was happening. The deliberate attempt to discredit, to bury her son's light beneath the oldest weapon of all, accusation. Dr. Whitmore didn't intervene. Instead, he watched with quiet approval, as though the rival student was doing the work for him. The silence from the professors was permission enough for the smear to take root. Jalen's pulse roared in his ears. He wanted to shout, to protest, to defend himself. But he knew his words could twist against him. He remembered the whispers his mother had overheard. He'll never belong, he's just lucky. And yet, he also remembered the rhythm he had seen, the flaw no one else noticed. That truth didn't vanish, because someone called it a lie. He closed his notebook slowly, his hand steady despite the fire in his chest. His eyes lifted, meeting the gaze of the boy who had accused him. I didn't steal it, Jalen said softly, and I don't need you to believe me for it to be true. The rival boy smirked wider, sensing victory in the very denial. He turned to the professors, his voice loud. See? He can't prove it, he just wants attention. The room buzzed, tension thick as smoke. All eyes shifted back to Jalen, waiting, not for his explanation this time, but for his collapse. The rival student's accusation hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. He just wants attention, the boy said again, louder, inviting the room to agree. And slowly they did. At first it was whispers, mutters of yeah, that makes sense, and he couldn't have thought of this. Then the whispers hardened into statements, firm, sharp, unquestioned. He read it somewhere. He's memorizing, not solving. He's trying to embarrass us. Their voices layered until they became a wall, heavy and unyielding. Jalen stood small at the front, his notebook pressed against his chest like a shield. He looked from face to face, searching for someone, anyone, to step forward and say, no, he's right. Give him a chance. But no one did. The very students who had been struggling with the problem moments before now turned on him, their fear of being outshone stronger than their pursuit of truth. It was easier to believe he was a fraud than to accept that a 12-year-old boy had seen what they missed. The sandy-haired boy smirked, feeding the fire. If he's so smart, why doesn't he just solve it on the board right now? Let's see him prove it in front of everyone. Cheers of agreement followed. Yeah, put it up there. Show us genius. But the cheers weren't encouragement, they were bait. They wanted him to fail publicly, to crumble under the weight of their stares. From the professor's table, Dr. Whitmore remained silent, his lips curved in that same faint smile. He didn't need to say anything. The students were doing his work for him. Jalen's chest tightened. His throat felt raw. He wanted to shout, to insist that he didn't need to prove anything more. But their voices drowned him, filling every corner of the hall until his truth felt small, fragile, almost imaginary. Danielle watched from the back, her fists trembling at her sides. She knew this pattern too well. She had seen it in the hospital, in meetings, in every space where her voice had been stolen. The crowd closing ranks, the wall of dismissal rising higher, suffocating truth beneath it. And she saw something even crueler. Some of the students didn't look angry. They looked relieved. Relieved that they had someone to unite against, someone to carry the burden of their failure so they didn't have to. Jalen's voice finally broke through, soft but sharp. I don't need to prove it to you, he said. The laughter was instant, merciless. A girl in the second row rolled her eyes. Of course you don't. Because you can't. Another boy added, he's scared. He knows he's bluffing. The wall closed tighter. For the first time, Jalen's eyes flickered, not with fear, but with something heavier, betrayal. He had thought maybe, just maybe, one of them would see what he saw, that the truth would matter more than pride. But pride was safer, pride was easier, and so they chose it over him. Danielle's breath caught. She could see the fire in her son's chest flickering under the storm. If the flame went out now, she feared it might never return. The rival student pressed forward, seizing control of the moment. "Look at him," he said, gesturing to Jalen. "He's not one of us. He doesn't belong in this room. They only let him in because they didn't want to look bad, and now he's trying to steal the spotlight." The words sliced deeper than the laughter. "Not one of us." The hall buzzed with agreement. Students nodded. Professors exchanged quiet, complicit glances. The lie had become fact simply because enough voices shouted it. Jalen felt his knees weaken. His notebook trembled in his hands. He thought of all the nights spent hunched over pages, searching for patterns no one asked him to see. He thought of his mother working late, her hands blistered, just to buy him pencils and paper. He thought of the truth glowing in his mind, so clear, so real, and how quickly the room had crushed it under weightless words. For the first time, the temptation of silence pulled at him. If he stayed quiet now, if he sat down, the storm would pass. They would forget him, and he could slip back into invisibility. But then he saw her. Danielle had risen from her chair in the back. Slowly, deliberately, she stood tall, her presence suddenly impossible to ignore. Her eyes burned with the fury of a woman who had swallowed silence for years, who had watched injustice carve scars into her life, and who refused to let it bury her son alive. The rival student faltered for a moment, his smirk flickering as the crowd noticed her standing. The hall shifted. Uneasy. Parents weren't supposed to intervene. Mothers weren't supposed to speak here, especially not this mother. Danielle's voice was still silent, but her presence alone was defiance. Every head turned, every gaze landed on her, and in that moment, the air thickened with a new tension. Because Danielle Carter was not just a parent rising, she was a challenge to the very structure of the room, to the unwritten rules that said people like her had no voice here. Danielle inhaled sharply, ready to speak, but the question loomed heavy over the hall. Would they even allow a black mother's voice to be heard in this place that had already decided her son did not belong? The room was already shifting when Danielle rose to her feet, her presence igniting unease across the hall. But before she could even open her mouth, Dr. Whitmore's hand sliced through the tension. "That will be enough," he said firmly, his eyes flicking toward her like a warning. He turned back to the room, reclaiming authority. If Mr. Carter insists he found this so-called flaw, then let him prove it. Here, now. The words struck the air like a gavel. The students erupted, some with laughter, others with sharp applause, eager for the spectacle.
Yeah, make him show us.
"Put it on the board. This'll be over quick." Danielle froze mid-step, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to object, to tear through the cruelty of turning her son into a sideshow. But the eyes on her burned hotter now, cold, expectant, warning her not to interfere. She lowered herself back down, trembling, her heart hammering. At the front, Dr. Whitmore gestured to the massive chalkboard. "If you're telling the truth, Mr. Carter, prove it. Step by step. No notebooks, no notes. Work it live, where we can all see." Jalen's stomach dropped. The wall of chalk loomed larger than ever, the symbols sprawling like a mountain he was being dared to climb. His fingers tightened around his notebook, the one place where his rhythm made sense, where his private work lived. To leave it behind felt like stepping into battle without armor. Whitmore wasn't finished. His lips curved in a thin smile. "And since you claim it's simple, we'll make it fair." He turned to one of the professors at the side table. "Set a timer. 10 minutes. If he hasn't shown us by then, we'll know the truth." Gasps rippled through the room. 10 minutes. Not hours. Not days, like the graduate students had been given. Just 10. The rival student grinned, leaning back in his chair. "This is gonna be fun." Jalen's pulse thundered in his ears. 10 minutes. Every misstep, every pause, every tremor of doubt would be seized and magnified. He could feel the trap tightening. This wasn't about proof, it was about crushing him under pressure. But then his eyes found Danielle again. She sat rigid, her jaw clenched, her gaze locked on him. Her eyes didn't plead this time. They commanded, "Don't you dare bow." He swallowed hard. His notebook slipped from his fingers onto the desk with a soft thud. Slowly, with trembling hands, he stepped toward the board. The professors watched with thinly veiled anticipation. Students leaned forward, pens ready to record not the solution, but the spectacle of collapse. The hall buzzed with cruel expectancy. A professor at the side table clicked a stopwatch. The sharp beep echoed like a gunshot. "Begin," Dr. Whitmore said. Jalen froze for a second, his back to the room, staring at the chalk clutched between his fingers. His hand shook so badly, he nearly dropped it. The board towered before him, the symbols glaring down like judges. He closed his eyes. In the darkness he saw it again. The rhythm, the crack in the wall, the thread waiting to be pulled. He heard his mother's voice echoing, "Show them, baby. Even if your hands shake." His eyes opened. His grip steadied. He pressed the chalk to the board. The first line screeched across the surface, white against black. The sound made students snicker. "Listen to him," one whispered. "He's shaking so much the chalk's gonna break." But Jalen didn't stop. He wrote the first correction, the small adjustment that shifted the balance. He spoke as he wrote, his voice quiet but carrying. "The constant doesn't distribute here. If you bring it across without balancing, you break the sequence. That's why it fails later." The laughter faltered, if only for a moment. The stopwatch ticked down. Jalen moved to the second step, his hand faster now, lines forming patterns. His voice threading explanation through the silence. "If you reset it here, the rhythm changes. Look, the terms don't collapse. They align." Students began to scribble again, this time not with derision, but with growing unease. Some frowned, their pens tracing his steps reluctantly, unwilling to admit but unable to deny. The stopwatch ticked. 7. Dr. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Faster, Mr. Carter. Show us it works to the end." Jalen's chest heaved, but he pushed forward, chalk dust collecting on his fingertips. The lines filled the board, his small handwriting precise, deliberate, his words steadied as he explained each move, each correction, each piece of the puzzle falling into place. The laughter had died now. In its place was a heavy quiet, broken only by the scratching of chalk and the relentless tick of the stopwatch. 6:10. Danielle's breath came shallow, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream at them for the cruelty of the countdown, but she held herself still. Her boy was speaking louder than she ever could. Jalen's arm ached, his fingers cramped, but the rhythm carried him. He was no longer thinking of the room or the voices behind him. He was inside the problem, inside the truth he had seen, pulling the thread with steady determination. The rival student shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his notes. For the first time, the smug grin faltered. His pencil scratched furiously, trying to keep up, and failing. Whitmore's voice sliced in again. 3 minutes left. Jalen's breath quickened. Sweat gathered at his temple, but he didn't slow. His voice rang louder now, each word firm, as if to hammer his truth into the walls themselves. "You said it was impossible because you built it wrong. Fix the first step, and it works. The rest isn't magic, it's math." The stopwatch glowed. Jalen reached the final step, his chalk smudging, his handwriting messier but still precise. He circled the last number, his chest heaving. His hand slipped slightly, leaving a faint streak of chalk across the board. The room leaned forward, every breath held. The stopwatch ticked to 1 hour. Jalen's hand trembled as he gripped the chalk tighter, standing before the board. 1 minute left to prove his truth to a room waiting for him to collapse. The chalk squeaked with every stroke, each line landing like a defiant heartbeat against the vast blackboard. Jalen's hand trembled, but his writing was clear, deliberate. He had tuned out the whispers now, tuned out the cruel smirks. All that remained was the rhythm of the numbers, the truth he had carried silently in notebooks no one had bothered to open. Every step built on the one before it, a staircase of logic that stretched upward while the professors sat rigid below. Their eyes narrowed, some with irritation, some with reluctant intrigue. Students hunched over their notes, trying desperately to follow what they had once mocked as childish nonsense. It was no longer laughter that filled the air. It was silence, the stunned kind that lingers when arrogance meets undeniable evidence. Danielle felt her chest tighten with every mark her son made. This was no longer just a boy with chalk. This was a child rewriting a room that had been designed to exclude him. Each symbol was a blow against years of dismissal, each explanation a crack in the wall of superiority they had built. The timer beeped faintly in the corner. Jalen spoke louder now, his voice steady. If you track the rhythm correctly, the sequence doesn't collapse. It extends. The terms balance here. He circled a section of the board. And here, another circle. The pattern holds. It always held. You just didn't see it. A professor in the front row leaned forward, his glasses sliding down his nose. His lips parted slightly, disbelief spreading across his face. Another professor muttered under her breath, "This can't be." But it was. Students who had scoffed minutes before now scribbled furiously, their pens scratching against paper, desperate to catch up. Their faces flushed with realization. Some bit their lips, others frowned deeply, as if seeing their own pride reflected back at them in ugly clarity. Jalen didn't stop. His arm ached, sweat beaded on his forehead, but the rhythm carried him forward. His small voice, once drowned by laughter, now filled the room with certainty. You called it impossible because you didn't want to believe the mistake was yours. But it was. You built everything on the wrong first step. That's why you failed. Not because it couldn't be solved, because you refused to see. The words struck harder than chalk. They weren't just about the problem anymore. They were about the system that had labeled him luck, that had excluded him from lists, that had told him and his mother he would never belong. Danielle's hands trembled. She could feel the air shifting, the weight of centuries of dismissal pressed into this single moment. It wasn't just her son at that board. It was every voice silenced, every truth buried, every brilliance ignored because of who carried it. The timer ticked. Jalen's breath came fast, but his eyes stayed sharp. He pressed the chalk harder, the final steps spilling onto the board. Each mark was cleaner, firmer, as though his hand had finally stopped shaking. Not because the pressure had eased, but because he had learned to carry it. The rival student's smirk had vanished. His pencil lay idle on the desk, his face pale as he watched Jalen dismantle the very arrogance he had built his identity on. He muttered under his breath, too soft for most to hear, "No way." Dr. Whitmore's jaw clenched. He shifted in his seat, his knuckles whitening against the armrest. His lips curled, not with humor now, but with anger masked as skepticism. The boy had not collapsed. The boy had climbed. Jalen circled the final piece, his voice clear and unwavering. And here's the answer. Balanced. Whole. The sequence holds. The hall was silent. Not the silence of dismissal. Not the silence of mockery. But the silence of stunned recognition. Pens hung in midair. Mouths stayed open. Words caught in throats. Jalen exhaled, his chest heaving. He lowered his hand, the chalk dust clinging to his fingertips. For a second he stared at the board himself, half disbelieving that he had laid it all out in time. Wow! The final beep cut through the stillness. Jalen turned slowly, facing the room. The chalk slipped from his fingers, clattering softly against the floor. The sound rang louder than thunder in the gray lands. The solution was there, undeniable, glowing across the board like a mirror reflecting their blindness. But instead of applause, the first sound came sharp and furious. The slam of Dr. Whitmore's hand against the desk. His voice cut through the silence. "That's impossible. Where did you steal that answer from?" The echo of Dr. Whitmore's hand slamming the desk still reverberated across the hall when the silence cracked open into chaos. Some students shot to their feet, eyes wide, whispering furiously to each other. Others stared at their notes, recalculating with trembling hands, realizing that Jalen's solution, his correction, fit perfectly where theirs had failed. Then, unexpectedly, a slow clap broke the tension. It came from the gray-bearded professor who had leaned forward earlier, the only one who had stopped smiling when Jalen first spoke. His palms struck together deliberately, the sound ringing sharp against marble walls. "Correct," he said under his breath, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. The ripple spread. A younger professor followed, nodding reluctantly. "He's right," she admitted, almost begrudgingly. Her hands pressed together once, twice, then stopped as if she feared the weight of her own honesty. But just as quickly, resistance surged. Another professor, broad-shouldered, his suit perfectly pressed, snorted loudly. "This is a trick. A parlor performance. Anyone can make numbers dance if you write them sloppy enough." He gestured at the board dismissively. "Don't be fooled by theatrics." Dr. Whitmore seized on the opening, his voice sharp. "Exactly. Do not mistake audacity for genius. He has manipulated the sequence to appear balanced. This is not scholarship. This is spectacle." Students latched onto the words eagerly. Some nodded, muttering agreement. One shouted, "Yeah, he's just playing with it, not proving anything." The hall fractured, the line drawn down its center. On one side, reluctant recognition, a handful of professors and students daring to admit what they saw. On the other, denial sharpened into anger, unwilling to concede that a boy, and a black boy at that, had exposed their blindness. Danielle's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the tug of war stretching across the room. Truth against pride, light against the wall of arrogance. Her son stood at the board, small and trembling, but still upright. She wanted to run to him, shield him, but she knew this moment was his battle. The rival student seized the chance to reclaim control. He stood, his voice loud and commanding. "If he's right, then why hasn't anyone solved it before? You think a kid just waltzed in here and cracked it in 10 minutes when the rest of us couldn't? Come on, be serious." The students rallied behind him, their voices rising. "Yeah. It doesn't make sense. He's making us look stupid." Jalen's chest rose and fell quickly. He wanted to shout back, to remind them that he had warned them from the start. It was the first step they had gotten wrong, but the storm of voices swallowed him, their noise louder than truth. A professor slammed his notebook shut. "This is absurd. If we accept this, we undermine the entire structure of how we validate work. We can't just hand credibility to a child." The gray-bearded professor stood, his voice firmer now. "We don't hand credibility. We recognize truth. And truth doesn't care how old the mouth is that speaks it." The words hung like a blade in the room. For a moment, silence threatened to return, but the resistance was stronger. Dr. Whitmore pushed back his chair and rose to his full height, towering above the room. His voice carried like a gavel. "Enough. This farce has gone on long enough. You want to make a prodigy out of a boy who stumbled into coincidence. I will not allow this university's name to be sullied by—" He stopped just short of saying it, but the weight of the unspoken word "him" hung thick in the air. Danielle's hands trembled, her rage burning through her chest. She heard it even without him saying it. They weren't just rejecting her son's work. They were rejecting his right to even be here. Then an unexpected sound pierced the noise. Applause. Not slow, not reluctant, but steady, deliberate, rising from the far corner of the hall. A group of visiting graduate students, seated quietly until now, stood and clapped firmly. One of them raised his voice. "I checked it. Line for line. He's right. You all just didn't want to see it." The fracture widened. Half the hall now stood in defense, clapping hesitantly, while the other half sat frozen, furious, arms crossed like stone. Jalen turned slowly, his small eyes sweeping across the chaos. He didn't smile. He didn't shrink. He simply stood there, chalk dust still on his fingertips, his chest heaving. But the war in the room wasn't ending. It was escalating. Dr. Whitmore's face flushed deep red. His voice cracked like thunder. "This ends now." The doors at the back of the hall swung open with a heavy groan. Every head turned. A tall man entered, his presence commanding the room instantly. His suit was immaculate, his step slow but deliberate. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the chaos. It was the dean of the university. The dean's voice cut through the air, calm but heavy. "What," he demanded, "is happening in this hall?" The dean's entrance shifted the air instantly. Conversations cut short, whispers died mid-breath. The clash of voices that had consumed the hall now collapsed into uneasy silence. All eyes fixed on him as he strode forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor like a metronome counting down to judgment. Jalen stood frozen by the board, chalk dust on his fingertips, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. His eyes darted between the professors and the dean, unsure whether salvation or condemnation had just entered the room. Dr. Whitmore straightened his jacket, relief flashing across his face. He bowed his head slightly. "Dean Ellison, I apologize for the disruption. What you're seeing here is a performance. A child was mistakenly granted entry into this seminar." And the dean raised a single hand, silencing him. His gaze slid past Whitmore, landing directly on the board. The equations sprawled in white across black, layered with circles, corrections, and the final sequence Jalen had written. For a long moment, the dean said nothing, his eyes scanning line after line, his brow furrowed. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Students shifted in their seats, their pens idle, their breaths shallow. Professors leaned forward, eager to have their positions validated, whether for or against. Finally, Dean Ellison spoke. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Who wrote this?" Every head turned toward Jalen. The boy's throat tightened, but he managed a single word. "Me." A faint murmur rippled through the room. The dean took a step closer to the board, his eyes narrowing. He raised a hand, tracing one of the sequences with his finger in the air, following the logic silently. When he reached the end, his lips parted just slightly. "This," he said slowly, "is correct." The words hit the hall like an earthquake. Gasps erupted. Some students leaned back in shock. Others shook their heads violently, refusing to accept it. Professors exchanged frantic looks, some pale, others flushed with anger. The rival student's smirk crumbled entirely, his face draining of color. Dr. Whitmore's face contorted. "Dean, with all due respect," but Ellison cut him off sharply. "I said it's correct." His tone hardened. "This child has achieved what your seminar has failed to do for years." Danielle's knees nearly gave out where she stood. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. For years she had fought for her son to be seen. Not pitied, not tolerated, but seen. And now here it was. Undeniable. Jalen's chest heaved. He didn't smile. He didn't bask. He simply stood there staring at the dean, trying to process the words. Correct. He was correct. The dean turned to the professors. "And you." His voice thundered. "How many of you dismissed this child before he even picked up the chalk? How many of you laughed, mocked, insulted?" The silence was damning. No one spoke. Ellison's gaze sharpened, sweeping the room. "This is not just about mathematics. This is about arrogance, about blindness." A boy walked into this room with nothing but a notebook and courage, and instead of recognizing brilliance, you tried to bury it. Danielle's tears spilled freely now. She didn't wipe them away. A professor muttered bitterly. He was lucky. The dean's head snapped toward him. "Luck doesn't write this." He pointed at the board, his hand shaking with restrained fury. "Luck doesn't hold steady under the weight of ridicule. Luck doesn't expose the flaw everyone else ignored." The room splintered again. Some students, red-faced, began to clap hesitantly, their palms striking the air in reluctant acknowledgement. Others crossed their arms, refusing to move, their pride too heavy to surrender. Professors shifted uncomfortably, their power eroded by a truth they could no longer deny. And at the center of it all, Jalen Carter stood still, his small frame silhouetted against the vast blackboard, the dust of his defiance still clinging to his hands. The dean's voice softened, but only slightly. "History will remember this moment. Not as the day a boy embarrassed you, but as the day your arrogance nearly cost you the chance to witness brilliance." The rival student slammed his notebook shut, his face burning red. "This doesn't mean anything," he hissed. "It doesn't change the fact that he doesn't belong here." The dean's eyes locked onto him. "On the contrary," he said coldly, "it proves he belongs more than anyone." Danielle's chest swelled with pride so fierce it nearly broke her. For once she didn't need to speak. Her son had spoken for them both. But even as the room shifted, redemption was not whole. Some professors clapped reluctantly, their pride choking their throats. Others muttered, dismissing it as coincidence, already plotting ways to bury the story before it spread too far. Jalen felt it too. That even when truth was undeniable, resistance lingered. Racism did not fall in one moment. It bent, it recoiled, it waited for another chance. Still, he had carved his place into the world. No one could erase what was written across that board. The dean turned back to Jalen, his expression softening for the first time. "You've done what many could not. You've seen differently, and that is the essence of genius." Jalen lowered his eyes briefly, his chest heaving. He didn't know what to say. He didn't need to. The board spoke louder than he ever could. The hall erupted again, not in applause, not in unity, but in chaos. Shouts clashed with cheers, anger collided with reluctant admiration. Pride and prejudice battled in the air, the fracture of a system exposed by a child. And in the middle of it all, Jalen stood still, the world tilting around him. The chalk lay broken at his feet. His mother's tears shone like glass. And the camera of history froze on his face, once invisible, now unforgettable. The chaos swelled until it was unbearable, voices colliding in fury and awe. But the image that remained, burned into every mind, was the face of a boy who had dared to raise his hand when the world laughed. Stories like this aren't just fiction. They echo what so many live through in silence every day. If you believe voices like Jalen's deserve to be heard, don't let this moment fade. Type yes if you believe in justice, and subscribe if this broke your heart.